Music is the art of thinking with sounds. One could say that music is the perfume of hearing. You need to be very familiar with the families of sound represented in an organ and how they can work with you and for you in interpreting hymns.
Well, I think when we're singing a praise hymn, for example, I think the registration needs to reflect the praise that we're singing. If we're singing a prayer hymn, again, I think the registration needs to reflect a prayerful mood. So I'm going to, as an organist, I would use different registrations for praise hymns than I would for prayer hymns. Certainly the text would be a very important factor in registration. If I I sing the mighty power of God that made the heavens smooth. I mean, that marvelous text that brings me up, both in the score, the way the music is scored and notated, but also the words themselves. It helps me to sing with joy. If I'm singing Open My Eyes That I May See, I'm in a mood of prayer, and the words, even though they're saying open my eyes, it's a meditative text which calls me to prayer.
I hear things expressing pain and anguish, often having a reedy kind of sound. I hear some kinds of textures, musical and psychological, being involved with a kind of open sound, 8 and 2 or something like that. The sound, in other words, needs to have some sort of correlation with the content. The sound also needs to be audible to the singers. And it can be audible, put it another way, what prevents it from becoming inaudible is, first of all, that it be loud enough, but sometimes we can't hear things because they're too loud, and sometimes we can't hear them because they're not loud enough. But I think too loud is more often a problem than not loud enough. There's a wonderful, I remember Bill Albright one time saying something about describing one of his pieces, where he said that it had to be as quiet as possible so that you could hear it. And I think there's a lot in that. We need to be, it's any kind of ensemble music, that you need to have some sort of sense of what the other people are doing. And so registration can be helpful with that or unhelpful. Look for a shape within the total pattern of the words. You know, where are the high points and where are the low points? The climax isn't always in the last verse. And when I was a child, organists habitually played very quietly in the second last verse. That's so that the last verse would sound louder. But you know, that sometimes matches the sense, but usually doesn't. Some sort of sense of the kind of progression that goes on, I think, is important. Important for me, anyway.
Well, again, I think it's the nature of the hymn that is very important. And again, also, variety is very helpful, because when people hear the introduction to the hymn and realize that you are doing something with the organ that you didn't do with the last hymn, there must be a message here, there must be a reason. So the idea of planning the registration to reflect the hymn, the nature of the hymn, the message of the hymn, but also, again, we have to make it reflect the number of people who are singing it. There's also a kind of a dynamic in hymn singing. You start at a certain place and you end, obviously, at the end, but it should not have been the same all the way through. Each stanza either gets higher in excitement or lower. Sometimes we go back and forth, but these should be planned by the organist in the registration to reflect the mood and to reflect where we're going. Most hymns end in at least a semi-triumphant ending. because there is a stanza at the end which reminds us that God is faithful, or that God has promised this, or that God will see us through, or something like that. So most hymns end on a positive, triumphant note, at least mildly so. But nevertheless, we need to read them through so that each hymn does not sound the same as the one before. But probably the simplest answer would be that the registration should be carefully chosen in terms of the mood of the hymn, and also in terms of the people whose voices you will be accompanying.
You need to be very familiar with the room in which you're playing. One of the universal problems that organists encounter is that when we sit at an organ console, we are not hearing the real sense of sound that is being received in the room. So it is incumbent upon us all to be very familiar with what your instrument sounds like every place in the room.
The question of the way space affects organ playing is very complex, but it involves at least several different factors. One is the acoustical frame, whether it's live or dry. That affects tempo, and it probably has some more subtle implications for articulation, phrasing, and issues of that sort. But then the space is also affected by temperature. And I'm not sure what the connections are here. All one can say is that temperature and barometric pressure and humidity, apparently all those factors, if one is sensitive to them when he or she plays, require some response. It feels different if you listen on a day that's colder or wetter. And it feels different in different kinds of architectural frames too, whether it's stone or not. And there's no easy formula that says do this in one context and do this in another. It's simply a question of the organist being responsive to the space. Another issue that relates to the space is where people sit in the space, where the organ is located in the space, where other instruments might be located in the space, where the organ is related with reference to its console, where the choir sits, and then how that all is deployed in relation to the congregation.
If you regularly perform in an acoustically dry room, you will want to enliven your registrations by adding upper partials and higher pitches. Whereas if you are in a room that has very live acoustics and a lot of reverberation, you will not need all those higher pitches to reinforce the clarity of the organ sound. Adjustments must be based upon the room, the instrument, the size of the congregation, and the mood and text and message of the hymn that you are playing. Have a trusted colleague come and play the organ for you. And as they play the organ and use the registrations that you're accustomed to using, walk around the church. Be familiar with the back, the front, the sides, if you have a balcony. And better than that, See if your colleague could come and play a service for you, so that you, as a member of the congregation, can know exactly what the congregation is hearing. If you are playing hymns based only on the knowledge of what you hear from the console at the keyboard, you may not be sending out signals that you want your congregation to receive. Registering an organ depends upon the size of your instrument, your knowledge of the families of sounds, and your imagination. Probably 75 to 80% of the sounds on an organ come from the flute family of pipes. This includes principals, diapasons, which is synonymous with principal, flute sounds, and string sounds. The remainder of the organ comes from pipes of the reed family. We'll first listen to some examples of diapason. Diapason is a Greek word meaning from first to last, and it's aptly named because it is beautifully voiced to bring out the rich fundamentals and the higher partials throughout the compass of this rank of pipes. The diapason can be known also synonymously as a principal or montra. In the book are tables of various synonym names for these families of sound. The diapason is found on the organ at the 16-foot level, the 8-foot, the 4-foot, and at the 2-foot and in mixtures. The other family of sound, which can be used as the foundation for building ensembles, are the flutes. They are best used in the middle range of the keyboard. Listen to how it gets rather tubby in the lower extreme. Flutes can be substituted at the 8-foot pitch for a diapason if you want a more vertical sound in your plenum. We'll talk about a plenum a little bit later. The next flute sound on an organ is a string. These are usually very soft stops and would not be used for full congregational hymn singing. As you can hear, a string has a very highly developed overtone. Its advantage is that it sounds very clear in the lower register. It loses some of that clarity when you move up to the upper register. However, you can combine a flute and a string sound and get a smaller principal sound in another division. The last major family or category of sounds on the organ are the reeds. They can be solo reeds, they can be reeds that are a fanfare, and they can wonderfully undergird the pedal line in hymns. If your organ has different combinations of stops in these respective categories, You need to be familiar with all the names so that you can substitute what your organ has for what the requirements are of the hymn or the hymn prelude that you wish to play. You can refer to the book for various tables in a dictionary of organ stops. Since each organ that we would be playing lives in a different worship space, each one is voiced according to that room and to that worship space. So no two organs are exactly alike. But it is possible to talk about general specifics that relate to all organs. Most organs have 2 or 3 keyboards and a pedal board. The word keyboard is synonymous with the word manual, which means hand, and therefore both terms will be used interchangeably. Each of the keyboards represents a division, and within that division there are several ranks of pipes. Each rank of pipe is a different sound. These ranks of pipes are controlled by what we call stops. This is an historic term coming from the old mechanical instruments. When a draw knob used to be pushed in, it literally stopped the flow of air from the wind chest into the pipe. In modern nomenclature, stop is often used synonymously with register, and will be done so on this tape. A stop represents a full rank of pipes. On most organs, this means 61 notes. On some organs, this means 56 notes. When you have pulled out a stop representing one rank of pipes, that implies that one pipe for each note will sound. The organist has the opportunity to combine many ranks of pipes with different sounds. And so, when you depress one note, you have the capabilities of actually having many pipes sounding at one time. Registering an organ can be compared to being a cook because you have many different opportunities to combine tonal flavors and spices. Certain stops can bring on more than one rank. That is, certain individual stops can bring on more than one rank. These are called mutations and mixtures, and they can represent from 2 to 5 ranks of pipes speaking simultaneously. We will talk a little bit more about them later in the video. Stops marked as 8 foot sound at unison standard pitch. The 8 foot implies that on an open set of pipes, the lowest tone of that sound or rank is approximately 8 feet in length. In 4 foot ranks, that implies that the lowest pipe of that rank is 4 feet in length. In 2 foot ranks, the same principle holds true. And on the pedal division, when you see a 16 under the stop name, that implies that the lowest pipe in the pedal division is approximately 16 feet in length. The lower keyboard is called the grate, and as the name implies, the ranks of pipes that have a broader breadth of sound are included in the grate division. These are the stops that are most frequently used for hymn playing and hymn accompanying. The upper keyboard is called the swell division, and as its name implies, many times these pipes are enclosed with louvers that can be activated by a foot pedal, and these louvers can open and give the full sound range of the swell division, or they can be closed. And when they are closed, it causes a smaller dynamic sound to come out from the swell. Many times the swell has softer accompaniment stops as well as solo stops. So the fact that these pipes are under expression gives you more versatility in hymn accompaniment. On a 2-manual instrument, the 3rd division is the pedal division. These are lower pitched pipes which are carefully designed to blend with stops from both the swell and the grate. They contain both flue and reed pipes, which will be discussed in greater detail. You can connect the swell and the grate to the pedal through intermanual couplers. Many organs have 3 manuals. The third manual is called the choir manual. Sometimes it's called the positif. If it's called the choir manual, this often implies that it too is under expression. When we say under expression, we mean that the louvers are capable of being opened and closed, and this gives you some graduation of dynamics. Hence the name choir, because having a division like this is very helpful when accompanying or for softer stanzas. Organs lack standardization in their specifications and sounds. There's a good reason for this. There are many different organ makers and builders in the business, and each one of them uses a different formula for the specifications of their pipes. Also, many organs are of different sizes, from 11 ranks to 111. And so there are many variations and permutations that we are met with when we sit down at an organ console. If a suggested stop is not available from the ranks within the organ specifications that you're working with, try to find a substitute from the same family of sound. After you've become familiar with the different families of organ sounds and you've learned the different names by which they are called, you will begin to notice that each stop has a number attached to it. 16, 8, 4, 2, sometimes a Roman numeral, sometimes a fraction. If it's at the 8-foot pitch level, then you know that it's a fundamental pitch. And if you play a C on the organ, it's going to be the same as middle C on the piano keyboard. If you pull a stop out that has 4 foot, that means that you're playing the C an octave higher, even though you're depressing the very same note on the keyboard. If you pull a stop out that says 2 foot, that means that you're playing the pitch 2 octaves higher, even though you have not moved your finger on the keyboard. The silvery brilliance in organs comes when you combine these pitches at the different levels. The ultimate brilliance that you can achieve when registering is when you add stops that have the Roman numerals. This implies a mixture stop. A mixture with the Roman numeral 3 or 4 or 5 tells you that you've automatically activated 3 or 4 or 5 ranks of pipes. Usually they are speaking at the octave and 5th pitch. Mixture stops are designed to break back so that they provide equal brilliance at all levels of the organ keyboard. If you compared a mixture to a seasoning, it probably would be Tabasco. And it needs to be used with great discretion. Other stops that have mixed fractions imply that they are mutations. Mutations imply a spice rack, and there are many combinations and different seasonings that you can achieve by experimenting with mutations. The most common combination of a mutation is called a cornet, and that can be made by pulling an 8-foot, a 4-foot, a 2 2/3, a 2-foot, and a 1 3/5. And you have a beautiful solo stop. Within the families of organ sounds, there are many different names that pertain to the same quality of sound. This is because organs have been built in many different countries, and those names have traveled to America. There are German names, French names, English names. For example, a string texture can be called a solitonal, or viol, or gamba. A flute can be called a gedect, a flute, a chimney flute, harmonic flute. A principal sound can be called a mantra, diapason. In registering an organ, you will be well advised to have a clear understanding of the instrument which you're playing and organ consoles in general. Variety, substitution, and adjustments in registration need to be based on the instrument, the room, the size of the congregation, and the mood and texture of the hymn which you are playing. In building a good flute ensemble, it is better to think vertically than horizontally. In other words, try to use one stop of each pitch level. That means one 8-foot stop, one 4-foot, one 2-foot. If you add additional stops at various pitch levels horizontally, that is 2 or more 8-foot stops, make sure that you can hear a difference when those additional ranks are pulled on. A good caveat for organ registration is to remember that less is best. And if a stop that is pulled does not have a significant contribution to the ensemble sound that you desire, then it's not necessary. Regardless of the size of the instrument on which you are playing, there are certain general principles and rules that it is good to abide by. 8-foot ranks provide the foundation. So when you are registering for hymns, you generally would search for an 8-foot rank that will be the foundation of your ensemble. On most all organs, you'll have an opportunity to choose from a broader bass or a lighter textured 8-foot stop. If you are fortunate in having a well-voiced principal or diapason sound, that's always a good beginning. And as you expand that registration, find upper pitches that enhance but do not overpower your 8-foot foundation stop. For accompanying, it is good to choose less aggressive stops. Hymn playing does not have to accost the listener. It should give them a feeling of being surrounded by helpful sound. But you should never make your congregation feel as though they have to engage in a sound battle with the organ. Using a plenum registration, this implies principal stops or diapason stops. They are all of equal importance. In choosing a plenum registration, it is preferable to use one stop of each pitch level and to have each pitch level represented. In other words, do not leave out a 4-foot if you're building on an 8, 4, and 2-foot. To do so is called a skip registration, and it is not successful for good hymn accompanying. So that you can have a small plenum with an 8 and a 4 principal. If you wish to have a less broad foundation, you can substitute the 8-foot diapason or principal with a flute. When adding to a plenum, do not add other pitches at the same level, 8s, additional 8-foots, or additional 4-foots, but rather go up vertically so that you have 8, 4, 2-foot. The top of the plenum should always have a principal sound. On the grate, that's usually comprised by the mixture, which is made up of principal pipes. And at times when you want a very rich, full organ sound, sometimes your plenum on the manual can include a 16-foot. to complement the plenum that you've developed on the keyboard, you should have a 16-foot principal or diapason sound and an 8-foot, and always one pitch level less on the pedal division than you have in the manuals. In other words, if your highest pitch level is a 2-foot on the manuals, your highest pitch level on the pedal should be a 4-foot. Organs can be very individual in their makeup and sound. The choice of which stops to use can also be arbitrary and an individual decision. When choosing solo stops to highlight a melody, be very sure of the clarity and make sure that the accompaniment is substantial but not overpowering. Stops that work well for solos are reeds, combinations of mutations. Accompaniment stops that work well are flutes and diapasons, usually at the 8-foot level, sometimes at the 8 and 4-foot level. If you choose to solo out the melody of a hymn, choose a solo stop that has enough characteristic and higher overtone timbre so that it will be interesting and clear to the congregation. You will need to choose an accompaniment that is less aggressive, and there needs to be a careful balance between your solo stop and the accompaniment, because the accompaniment also supports, and it needs to be clearly heard for the foundation. If you need to increase accompaniment stops, again, it is most helpful to go to a higher pitch rather than an adjacent pitch. In other words, if your accompaniment is of the 8-foot level and you feel that it needs a little enhancement, choose a light 4-foot stop rather than going to an additional 8-foot stop. One of the advantages you have as an organist is if your organ console has a combination action. This allows you to set 2 types of pistons, divisional pistons and a general piston which activates all of the divisions together, and also the coupling system, allowing you to transfer sounds from one manual or keyboard to another manual or keyboard. It is good to set these pistons in order of graduated sound, perhaps starting with number 1 as the softest and increasing as the numbers increase, you increase in dynamics. This can also hold true for general service playing, and there are some ideas suggested in the book. But let's listen to what a graduated combination of pistons might sound like. An example of graduated piston settings for one division can be heard this way. Just about everything that you do when playing the organ should be done in rhythm. That includes changing pistons. Let's illustrate the change of combinations or registration between stanzas. Notice that the piston change will be pushed during the time that the congregation is breathing. Most of us are very familiar with the beautiful text painting and spiritual emphasis that Bach put into his choral preludes. We, as organists, have that same opportunity, even with new hymn texts. Let's look for a moment at a hymn text by Ray Whitney, entitled "We Who Preach a Church United." Ray has succeeded in writing a text which offers us, as organists, many opportunities for some graphic text painting. In the beginning stanza, she talks about a church united. And then in the second line, she talks about a church divided. And in the last line of the first stanza, she goes back to the oneness. Now, for a very simple beginning, when you're talking about a church united and the oneness, a very easy way to get that message across to the congregation would be to use unison melody line. In the second line, when she talks about a church divided, then you could split the parts. In the second stanza, she gets more aggressive with her text painting. She talks about anger, pettiness, self-conceit, the fact that the church history has been marred by this. There's schism, discord, divide. It's not necessarily a pleasing thought, but it certainly is one of which we're all aware. You can help to bring this out in a graphic way through emphasis of rhythm and through harmonic changes. Since this text is new, and this tune is rather new in some hymnals, you will have to be judicious in doing the text painting under a very clearly stated melody until your congregation is comfortable with singing this hymn. In the last stanza, she brings us back into more accord. We are beseeching God to send His Holy Spirit to unite, again, the unity, and to purify the fragmented church. And she talks in the last few lines about truly one body. And the very last word is unity. And therefore, again, by subtle harmonic changes, you can help to show that out of the anger and discord and the instability of the second stanza, you can end with beautiful consonant sounds. Let's listen to something of this interpretation.
Look at the text, and it's a curious thing, and I don't know whether this is this will hold up under very scientific exploration, but I find it almost curious that contained in the first phrase of a song, of a hymn text, is frequently some color word that suggests something very clear about tempo, but even more so about articulation. Take "How Firm a Foundation," for example. And you have the word firm. And for us musicians, if we saw something in Italian up there above the first line, we'd know exactly what that articulation meant, but we don't think so much about how the text itself that's being sung suggests an articulation. Either the sound of the text, if there are a lot of F's or S's or who knows what letter, or if there is some word like firm or sweet or whatever. And so oftentimes I find it helpful to look for those kinds of cues in the text as to what kind of articulation, what kind of tempo, what kind of dynamic level a piece should be sung at.
Singing should always be a joyous, pleasant, fulfilling experience. And your registrations should always serve to surround and uplift the congregation without overpowering them. Don't fatigue the members of your church by forcing registrations that are too loud and make them feel as though they're being overpowered by the organ. You and your instrument are there to inspire and assist them. We need to be pilots, not drill masters.